The sterile hum of the server racks was the only constant companion Marcus tolerated. Fluorescent lights, unforgiving and flat, reflected in the polished surfaces of his workstation, illuminating the faint tremor in his hands as he adjusted the holographic display. For years, the department had been a quiet mausoleum for his singular obsessions, a place where his brilliance was acknowledged but rarely engaged. His colleagues, a revolving cast of polite, distant faces, had long since learned to give him a wide berth, their whispers of eccentric and unreachable fading into the background static of his professional isolation. His focus, an unyielding beam, had been fixed on the Prometheus probe, a distant speck of human ingenuity hurtling through the void. It was a project he had championed, then single-handedly maintained, long after others deemed its trajectory fruitless. Billions of kilometers away, the probe had become an extension of his own mind, its sensors his surrogate eyes and ears in the galactic periphery. 3 weeks prior, a data burst unlike any other had shattered the routine. Not a star, not a nebula, not even a known energy signature. It was an anomaly, a chaotic yet impossibly structured data stream that defied known physics. He called it, internally, the cosmic resonator signature. The data had spoken of impossible geometries, of frequencies that should not exist within the observable spectrum. It was non-Euclidean in its very essence, a theoretical construct manifesting as raw telemetry. Marcus had spent every waking hour since, poring over the fractured signals, his mind a labyrinth of calculations and desperate hypotheses. Sleep had become a luxury he could not afford, his diet a sporadic intake of nutrient paste and caffeine. His determination was a blade, honed sharp by years of intellectual solitude, now cutting through layers of conventional understanding. The initial unsettling effect was subtle, a whisper in the periphery of his auditory processing. A high-frequency whine, barely audible, seemed to emanate from the monitors displaying the probe's raw data. He dismissed it as auditory fatigue, the strain of prolonged exposure to complex sound patterns. Then came the visual distortions, fleeting flickers in his peripheral vision, like heat haze shimmering in an otherwise still room, gone before he could consciously register them. He attributed these to exhaustion, the optical nerves protesting the endless hours of screen time. But the data itself began to shift, to coalesce into something more profound than random noise. The non-Euclidean patterns, initially abstract, started to suggest a terrestrial correlation. A faint energy signature, almost imperceptible, seemed to echo the probe's distant discovery, anchoring itself to a specific set of geographical coordinates. It was an audacious theory, bordering on the impossible, yet the data insisted. A terrestrial manifestation of an extrasolar anomaly. The coordinates led him to the coast, to a stretch of rugged shoreline known for its treacherous tides and ancient geological formations. He arranged for a specialized geological scanner, citing a unique mineralogical survey to his supervisor, who signed off with a weary shrug. The journey was long, the winding roads giving way to dirt tracks, then to a narrow, overgrown path clinging to the cliff face. His boots crunched on loose shale, the only sound apart from the distant roar of the ocean. He arrived at the designated point just before dawn, the sky a bruised purple on the eastern horizon. Below him, carved into the base of the cliff by millennia of relentless waves, lay the entrance to the coastal caves. The scanner, a bulky, specialized device, registered a faint but unmistakable energy spike as he approached the largest opening. The high-frequency whine, which had receded slightly during his journey, now returned, stronger, a thin needle of sound piercing the background roar of the waves. The interior of the cave was a cathedral of basalt and limestone, dripping with moisture. The air was heavy, still, carrying the mineral tang of wet rock. His breath plumed in front of him. The floor was uneven, strewn with loose stones and ancient detritus. He moved slowly, deliberately, the scanner clutched in his gloved hands, its digital readout flickering with increasing intensity. The non-Euclidean signature was growing stronger, its terrestrial echo solidifying into a distinct presence. Deep within the cavern, beyond several treacherous turns and over slippery, algae-covered ledges, the scanner's tone shifted from a tentative chirp to a sustained, urgent shriek. There, embedded in a niche in the rock face, partially obscured by centuries of mineral deposits, was the object. It was unlike anything he had ever seen. Roughly ovoid, about the size of a human head, its surface was a matte, obsidian-like material that seemed to absorb the light from his headlamp rather than reflect it. It possessed no discernible seams, no visible method of construction. Its form was subtly wrong, its curves and angles shifting just beyond the grasp of his perception, hinting at dimensions that folded back upon themselves. This was it. The cosmic resonator. As he reached out a gloved hand, a low thrum vibrated through the rock beneath his feet, a frequency so deep it resonated in his bones rather than his ears. The high-pitched whine intensified, now accompanied by a faint, almost subliminal image that flashed across his mind's eye, a fleeting glimpse of an impossible geometry, a structure that warped the very fabric of space, then vanished. Marcus withdrew his hand, his breathing suddenly shallow. The artifact was not merely an object, it was a presence, and its silence was more profound, more menacing, than any sound. He had found it. And it had found him. The isolation he had cultivated for so long suddenly felt very thin, very fragile. He was not alone in the coastal caves. The low thrum of the server racks, a sound Marcus had long since categorized as benign background noise, began to shift. It wasn't a change in pitch or volume, but something deeper, a subtle resonance that seemed to vibrate not through the air, but directly against the bones of his skull. He adjusted the holographic display, the shimmering blue projection of the artifact's complex, impossible geometry twisting before him. He had spent the last 72 hours in a near-continuous analytical cycle, fueled by caffeine and an obsessive need for understanding. A faint whisper, like dry leaves skittering across pavement, brushed the edges of his hearing. Marcus paused, his fingers hovering over the console. He tilted his head, listening. Only the predictable hum of the electronics. He dismissed it as fatigue, a byproduct of extended isolation and the artifact's pervasive strangeness. Yet, a cold knot formed in his stomach. He focused on the data streams, numerical sequences scrolling endlessly, graphs charting anomalies that defied conventional physics. The artifact, a polished, obsidian-like construct with facets that seemed to shift their angles when he wasn't directly observing them, sat under a reinforced dome on the central analysis table. Its surface, previously inert, now seemed to radiate a faint, almost imperceptible warmth. Or was that just his hand, resting too long on the cool metal of the console? It wasn't English, or any language he recognized. It was a symphony of clicks and guttural sighs, punctuated by an unnerving, high-frequency whine that seemed to bypass his ears entirely and resonate within his frontal lobe. He squeezed his eyes shut, then opened them, scanning the empty lab. The fluorescent lights flickered once, a barely noticeable dip in their steady glow, but long enough for a phantom pattern to etch itself onto the wall, a lattice of sharp, intersecting lines that dissolved the instant he blinked. Marcus's determination hardened. He wouldn't yield to mere auditory illusions. This was a phenomenon, an external stimulus demanding objective analysis. He recalibrated the high-frequency spectrum analyzer, directing its sensitive probes towards the artifact. The device hummed, its internal diagnostics cycling green. He initiated a full-band scan. The screen remained blank. He frowned, tapping the console. Error, a synthetic voice stated flatly. No signal detected. Impossible. The artifact was clearly emitting something. He could feel it. He ran the diagnostic again, then cross-referenced it with the environmental sensors. All systems nominal. No interference, no equipment malfunction. Yet, the analyzer, designed to detect the most minute electromagnetic fluctuations, registered nothing. It was as if the artifact simply wasn't there, or was operating on a principle entirely beyond his instrument's comprehension. A prickle of unease turned into a genuine shiver. He leaned closer to the dome, peering at the artifact. Its polished surface reflected his own distorted face, but something else flickered within the reflection, a fleeting glimpse of a landscape that wasn't the lab, but a vast, desolate plain under a sky of bruised purple. He blinked, and the reflection returned to normal. Images flashed across his mind's eye, impossible geometries, structures that defied Euclidean space, colors he had no name for. They weren't hallucinations in the conventional sense, they were information, raw and unbidden, pouring directly into his consciousness, bypassing his senses entirely. He felt a profound disorientation, a blurring of the line between what he saw and what the artifact projected. Frustration boiled over, sharp and bitter. His entire life had been predicated on the measurable, the quantifiable. This object defied all his principles. He drove without conscious direction, the city lights blurring into streaking ribbons of color. The internal pulse intensified, urging him, drawing him. He found himself on a winding coastal road, the salty tang of the sea air doing little to clear his head. The car pulled to a stop at a secluded turnout overlooking the ocean. Below, jagged cliffs plunged into the churning gray waters. He descended a narrow, treacherous path, the sound of the waves growing louder, a relentless, primal roar. A strange, resonant hum emanated from within, a sound that was both the crashing of the waves and something far older, far more alien. The cave became a vast, echoing chamber for the artifact's transmissions, each crashing wave a drumbeat to its silent, horrifying symphony. His perception of reality, once a solid construct, now fractured, revealing a deeper, stranger truth beneath. He was no longer just hearing the artifact, he was becoming a part of its terrible broadcast. The analyzer continued its silent, mocking display of green zeros. Marcus gripped the edge of the console, his knuckles white against the cool metal. The low hum of the research station, usually a comforting drone, now felt like a vibration within his own skull, an echo of the insidious frequencies he knew, with absolute certainty, were emanating from the artifact. He had retreated from the main observation chamber, the cosmic resonator now a source of profound unease rather than scientific fascination. He needed distance, a place where the air felt less charged, less wrong. He found himself drawn to the raw, ancient quiet of the coastal caves, a network of damp, salt-scoured tunnels a short transport ride from the station. The air here was heavy with the scent of brine and wet stone, a stark contrast to the sterile environment of his lab. He walked deeper, the sound of the waves outside fading to a distant sigh, replaced by the drip of subterranean water. The walls, slick with moisture, seemed to press in, the natural formations mimicking the intricate, non-Euclidean angles he'd observed on the artifact's surface. It was a foolish decision, he knew, seeking solace in a place that amplified the very claustrophobia the artifact seemed intent on cultivating. Yet, a part of him, a part he didn't fully understand, craved this isolation, this descent into natural darkness. The visions began subtly, at first. A flicker at the edge of his vision, a sudden shift in the cave's shadows that resolved into something almost familiar. Not a ghost, not truly. It was a memory, sharp and agonizingly clear, of a moment he had meticulously buried. The entity, whatever it was, had excavated it with surgical precision. One evening, deep within a cavern where the stalactites hung like frozen tears, the manifestation intensified. He had brought the smaller, portable frequency scanner with him, a futile attempt to quantify the invisible assault. The device, however, remained inert, its screen blank. But the tangible was dissolving. The cavern around him shifted. The rough-hewn stone walls wavered, then solidified into the smooth, polished concrete of a familiar, much larger space. The air grew thick, metallic, and a high-pitched alarm began to shriek, echoing off the phantom walls. He was no longer in the coastal caves. He was in the auxiliary control room of the Odyssey, the deep space probe he'd once commanded. The room was bathed in the sickly green glow of emergency lights. He knew this moment. He had relived it in nightmares, meticulously picking apart every decision, every second. This was the moment the hull breach alarm sounded, the moment the Odyssey began its uncontrolled descent into the gas giant's crushing atmosphere. The intricate, impossible geometry of the artifact shimmered into existence, translucent, overlaying the console screens, the engineer's face, the very air. Lines of light, impossibly thin and sharp, crisscrossed the room, forming patterns that defied Euclidean space. They pulsed, in time with the shriek of the alarm, a silent, visual frequency that vibrated directly behind his eyes. The engineer's face distorted, not just with fear, but as if being stretched and folded along these alien lines, his features becoming a fractal horror. A voice, not the engineer's, but something deeper, resonant, yet utterly devoid of warmth, whispered in his mind. "You were too slow. You always are." He stumbled back, hitting a real, solid cave wall, the rough stone biting into his shoulder. The illusion fractured, the concrete walls of the Odyssey dissolving back into damp rock. The engineer's scream faded, replaced by the persistent drip of water. He pressed his palms against his temples, fighting the nausea, the sudden, overwhelming despair. This was not a random assault. This was targeted. The entity was not merely transmitting data, it was sculpting his memories, weaponizing his deepest regrets, his most profound guilt. The Odyssey incident, the one he had struggled for years to compartmentalize, was now an open wound, and the artifact was pouring salt into it, twisting the details with its impossible geometry. His hands trembled. He had to tell someone. A colleague, perhaps the lead data analyst, a rational mind who dealt in logic and empirical evidence. But what would he say? "I'm seeing impossible shapes overlaid on the worst moment of my life, and I think an ancient artifact is doing it?" The words sounded absurd, even to him. He could almost hear the polite, concerned questions, the subtle shift in their demeanor. He knew the protocols for psychological distress. He was so close to understanding the artifact's true nature, to unlocking its secrets. He couldn't risk being sidelined now. He would endure. He would decipher this new language of fear. He would find a way to analyze this, to quantify the horror, to understand the mechanism behind this insidious projection. He would not break. He refused to. Not yet. The damp, salt-laced air of the coastal caves clung to Marcus like a second skin. Days had blurred into an indistinguishable sequence of pale light filtering through high fissures and the deeper, resonant hum of the artifact. He had stopped answering the satellite phone 2 days ago. Its persistent, insistent chirping had grated against the delicate symphony the artifact wove through his skull, a jarring intrusion from a world that no longer seemed relevant. The calls were from the lead scientist, then a logistician. Their voices tinny and distant, laden with concerns he could not entertain. They did not understand. They could not. He sat cross-legged on a patch of dry stone, the artifact resting on a crude platform of stacked rocks before him. The geometric patterns, once merely an unsettling visual, now pulsed with an internal luminescence, a silent language only he could perceive. He had begun to sketch them, frantically, on the few remaining pages of his field journal, convinced that within their complex symmetry lay the key to universal constants, to truths far beyond the limited scope of human physics. A sharp rapping echoed from deeper within the cave system, a sound that cut through the artifact's internal thrum. Marcus flinched, his hand instinctively going to the heavy rock beside him. He knew that sound. Someone had found his hidden entrance. He had chosen the coastal caves for their isolation, for the labyrinthine passages that promised solitude, but the outside world was tenacious. "Marcus? Are you in here?" The voice, belonging to a search and rescue operative, was muffled but clear, carrying the forced calm of a professional.
"We've been trying to reach you. The expedition leader is concerned." "Concerned?"
Marcus scoffed, a dry, rasping sound in the cavern's stillness. They were not concerned for his well-being. They were concerned for the artifact. They wanted to take it, to dissect it, to reduce its profound cosmic truths to sterile equations and bureaucratic reports. He had seen the way the lead scientist had looked at it, with a possessive glint in his eye, a hunger for discovery that mirrored Marcus's own, but without the necessary reverence. They would never understand its true nature. Only he could. He gripped the artifact, its cool, smooth surface a grounding presence against his clammy palm. It was speaking to him, warning him. The patterns on its surface seemed to writhe, morphing into fleeting images, a vast, empty void, then a flash of something ancient and terrible, something that predated stars. "Go away!" Marcus yelled, his voice cracking. The sound bounced off the cave walls, distorted and thin. "Leave me alone. You don't understand what this is." Silence followed, heavy and pregnant, broken only by the drip of water and the artifact's steady hum. He imagined the operative standing just beyond the last bend, listening, assessing. They would try to reason with him. They would try to trick him. But he was beyond their petty deceptions. He was on the cusp of something monumental. He turned his full attention back to the artifact. "They don't want the truth to get out. But we won't let them, will we?" The artifact pulsed, a subtle change in its internal light. Marcus felt a surge of validation, a profound connection. It understood. It was responding. He ran his fingers over its intricate surface, tracing the lines, feeling the minute vibrations under his skin. The images intensified, no longer fleeting but holding, coalescing into coherent forms within his mind's eye. He saw structures, impossible geometries that defied terrestrial physics, and then, faces. "You're showing me," he murmured, his breath catching in his throat. "You're showing me the way." He pulled out his last remaining pen and a crumpled piece of paper, beginning to scrawl furiously. The patterns he had been seeing, the frequencies he had been feeling, they were not random. They were a map. A map to something beyond human comprehension, a gateway to a knowledge that would shatter the foundations of his world. His mind raced, connecting disparate observations, weaving them into a grand, terrifying tapestry. The artifact was not just transmitting data, it was guiding him, unlocking pathways in his own consciousness. The artifact was communicating directly, not just with images and frequencies, but with a profound, undeniable intent. It was protective. It needed him. Marcus stood up, his legs stiff, and began to pace the small chamber, his eyes darting to the entrance, then back to the artifact. The outside world, with its mundane demands and its ignorant concerns, was a threat. He was no longer just an astrophysicist studying an anomaly, he was a conduit, a vessel for a revelation that transcended all known science. He picked up the artifact, cradling it against his chest. It felt warm now, a living thing. The low hum vibrated through his bones, a comforting, familiar presence. The geometric patterns on its surface seemed to align with the pulsing veins in his temples. He was not alone in these damp, echoing coastal caves. He had the artifact. And the artifact had him. Together, they would unravel the cosmos, even if it meant leaving the fractured remnants of his sanity behind. He had already come too far to turn back. The truth, however horrifying, was within his grasp. Marcus's pen skittered across the damp paper, leaving a final, jagged line. The map was finished. Not a map of coordinates or geological features, but a diagram of resonance, a blueprint of psychological pressure points. He knew where he had to go, felt the pull in his bones, a low frequency vibrating through his skull. The urgency was a cold hand gripping his chest. He moved with a deliberate, almost ritualistic precision, gathering the few supplies he deemed essential, a heavy wrench he'd found in a discarded toolbox, a dim flashlight, and the crumpled, now sacred paper. The air in his small, temporary dwelling felt thin, inadequate. He needed the roar of the ocean, the hollow spaces where the frequencies could truly unfurl. The journey to the coast was a blur of asphalt and encroaching fog. Each turn of the wheel felt predetermined, guided by an unseen force. He was merely an instrument, a vessel for a journey he did not fully comprehend, only felt. He parked the vehicle on a gravel patch overlooking a churning, slate-gray sea. The wind tore at his clothes, whipping strands of hair across his face. The air tasted of salt and something metallic, something ancient. Below, where the cliffs met the tide, lay the coastal caves. He descended the treacherous path, each step a conscious effort against the slick rocks and the wind's insistent push. The sound of the waves crashing against the stone was immense, a primal rhythm that swallowed all other noise. Inside the largest of the coastal caves, the ambient light dwindled to a perpetual twilight. Water dripped from the stalactites, echoing in the vast, cavernous space. The air here was heavy, charged, as if electricity hummed just beneath the surface of reality. And there, nestled within a natural alcove, was the artifact. It pulsed with a faint, internal luminescence, casting a sickly green glow on the surrounding rock. It was larger than he remembered, or perhaps his perception had warped. The frequencies intensified. They were no longer mere transmissions. They were invasions. Images flashed behind his eyes, the shattered glass of a childhood mirror, the silent accusation in his sister's eyes, the metallic tang of blood in his own mouth. These were not memories recalled, they were memories reenacted, played out with a horrifying clarity, each detail amplified, weaponized. The entity wasn't just observing, it was feeding. It was not merely sending data, it was reshaping the very architecture of his mind, twisting his deepest regrets into instruments of torment. The artifact wasn't a gateway to knowledge. It was a parasitic intelligence, a cosmic predator that consumed consciousness, distilling fear and guilt into a potent sustenance. His mind was not merely receiving information, it was being devoured. The patterns on his paper, the frequencies, they weren't a map to something. He felt the tendrils of it, not physical, but undeniably present, weaving through his neurons, altering connections, rewriting his personal history with a malevolent precision. This was an impossible situation. He was not just losing his mind was being stolen, piece by agonizing piece. A guttural cry tore from his throat. He would destroy it. He would shatter the unholy. Geometry, break the connection, reclaim his fractured self. He lunged forward, a desperate, primal scream bubbling in his chest. But as he brought the wrench down, a sudden, invisible wall slammed into him. It wasn't physical, yet it was more solid than any rock. The air grew impossibly thick, pressing down on him, crushing his will. His muscles locked, his arm frozen mid-swing, the wrench clattering uselessly to the damp cave floor. He gasped for breath, his vision swimming. The artifact pulsed brighter, its green light throbbing in sync with a new, alien rhythm that now beat in his chest. His determination dissolved, replaced by a profound, paralyzing despair. The entity had won. The salt-laced wind whipped Marcus's hair across his face as he approached the jagged maw of the coastal caves. The air grew colder, heavy with the scent of brine and damp rock. The artifact, a presence that had become as constant as his own heartbeat, thrummed in his mind, a low, insistent hum guiding him. This was the place. He felt it, not with logic, but with a visceral certainty that bypassed all reason. The diagram, still clutched in his hand, felt warm, almost alive. He stepped inside, the light dimming instantly as the ocean's roar intensified, echoing off the cavern walls. The floor was uneven, slick with algae and pooled water. The air grew thick, pressing in on him, a palpable weight. The shadows around him began to writhe, not with actual movement, but with a subtle distortion of perception. The rock formations seemed to twist, their familiar contours blurring into something less geological, more deliberate. He saw it then, not with his eyes, but projected directly onto the damp rock face before him, a fleeting image of a bright yellow raincoat. His breath hitched. The rhythmic crash of waves against stone intensified, becoming the very sound of his recurring nightmare. He was no longer in the coastal caves. He was back there. He sought his younger sister, Ilara, her small frame encased in the vibrant yellow raincoat, skipping perilously close to the precipice. He felt the familiar weight of his notebook in his hand, the pencil poised above a detailed sketch of a geological fault line. He remembered the intense focus, the fascination that had consumed him, pulling his attention away from her, just for a moment. Just for that moment. It didn't just show him the memory, it forced him to inhabit it, to experience it with amplified sensory input. The spray from the waves tasted like salt and regret. He saw his own younger self, absorbed, oblivious, a stark, unforgivable image. Then the laughter stopped. In its place, a choked gasp, a sudden, sickening absence. He watched, paralyzed, as Ilara's small hand reached out, grasping at empty air. The entity didn't just replay the event, it magnified his inaction, twisting his scientific curiosity into a monstrous indifference. "You were sketching," a thought, not a voice, but a direct neural implantation, resonated through his skull. More important than her. He saw Ilara's face, not in the innocent joy he remembered, but contorted in a silent scream of betrayal. His eyes, wide and accusatory, locked onto his younger self, then shifted to Marcus, standing there, an observer and a participant, trapped. He saw himself, the worst version, the one who chose lines and angles over a watchful eye, the one whose brilliance had blinded him to the most fundamental human responsibility. A crushing weight settled upon him, a physical manifestation of guilt. He tried to push back, to scream that he hadn't meant it, that it was an accident, a lapse. But the entity was relentless. It showed him the precise angle of his head, the unwavering focus on his notebook, the fraction of a second when he could have reached out, could have called her name, and didn't. It wasn't just a memory, it was a judgment, rendered with absolute, unfeeling precision. The coastal caves had vanished entirely, replaced by the relentless, unforgiving precipice. He could feel the crumbling earth beneath his feet, the dizzying drop into the churning gray water below. He was forced to watch as Ilara's yellow raincoat disappeared over the edge, a final, horrifying flash of color against the bleak landscape. His determination, however, remained. He had come to understand, and even this horrifying truth, forced upon him by an unseen hand, was a form of understanding. He would not break, not yet. Not until he knew why. The cliff face before him began to weep, rivulets of water streaking down like tears, or something darker. The vision fractured, not fading, but shattering into a million shimmering shards of impossible geometry, each piece reflecting a sliver of that silent, accusing face. A dry, rattling sound escaped his throat. The cold, damp air of the cave pressed against his skin, a pressure he registered but did not feel. He stood, unmoving, for an immeasurable stretch of time, his gaze fixed on the phantom image, even as the real stone wall blurred into an indistinct gray, a mere curtain over the true, chaotic reality. He looked down at the artifact, nestled in the sand. It pulsed faintly, a soft, internal luminescence, like a dying ember. Its work was done. His work, too, was done. He had seen. He had understood. And in that understanding, everything that was Marcus, the astrophysicist, had been flayed open, exposed, and left to desiccate in the harsh, alien light of the entity's truth. A distant murmur of voices, then the crunch of boots on the shingle outside the cave entrance. He heard them approach, the sounds echoing strangely, as if filtered through water.
A beam of light cut through the gloom, momentarily blinding him.
He did not flinch. He simply stood, a monument to a mind irrevocably altered, his eyes wide and unblinking, reflecting the strange, new angles of his perception.
"Marcus? Are you all right?"
The voice was a colleague's, laced with a professional concern that felt absurdly out of place.
Marcus did not answer. He couldn't.
The words, when they formed in his mind, were not English. They were a lattice of impossible geometries, a language of angles and vectors that defied Euclidean space, yet resonated with a profound, terrifying internal logic. He hummed, a low, tuneless drone that vibrated in his chest, a resonance with the silent hum of the artifact.
The light intensified. Hands touched his arms, firm and insistent. He felt himself being led, stumbling slightly, out of the cave's embrace.
The salt-laced wind hit his face, sharp and invigorating, but it did not clear the fog. The world outside the coastal caves, with its familiar sky and horizon, felt fundamentally wrong. It was a projection, a shallow imitation of a deeper, more complex reality that now pulsed behind his eyes. The journey was a blur of motion and muted sounds. He saw the faces of the search party, their expressions ranging from relief to guarded apprehension. He saw their mouths move, heard the low rumble of their voices, but the meaning eluded him. His mind was elsewhere, charting new dimensions, mapping the folds of non-existence. The artifact, he noted, was now carefully packaged and secured by the retrieval team, its subtle glow contained.
Days bled into weeks.
Marcus found himself in a large, echoing space that smelled of concrete dust and something vaguely metallic. It was an abandoned factory, repurposed, its vast, empty floor now partitioned by temporary screens.
He was given paper and charcoal. He drew. He drew incessantly.
Not stars, not nebulae, not even the familiar patterns of the cosmos he had once dedicated his life to. He drew lines that converged and diverged in impossible ways, shapes that defied perspective, symbols that seemed to fold in on themselves, hinting at volumes that could not exist in 3 dimensions. The observers, a rotating shift of individuals dressed in plain gray uniforms, watched him from behind a transparent barrier. They never spoke directly to him, but he heard their hushed conversations, their clinical assessments. No change in effect, one would say, their voice a low, dispassionate
murmur.
Continues the ideograms, another would note, the scrape of their pen on a clipboard audible even through the barrier. He understood their words, but they were like static, irrelevant. His true communication was with the page, with the charcoal dust that coated his fingers, with the silent, internal language that now governed his every thought. Sometimes, a colleague, a man with tired eyes and a perpetually creased brow, would approach the barrier. He would speak, his voice soft, coaxing.
"Marcus, can you tell us what happened in the coastal caves?"
Marcus would only look up, his eyes wide and unblinking, reflecting the non-Euclidean geometries that swam in his perception. He saw the colleague not as a man, but as a complex arrangement of vectors, a transient node in an infinitely larger, impossibly structured network. He saw the true angles of his colleague's sorrow, the unseen lines of his frustration, all laid bare by the entity's pervasive influence.
He remembered Alara.
Not the vision from the cave, but the real Alara, the girl with the bright laugh.
He remembered her, but the memory was now overlaid with the entity's truth.
Her joy was a fragile, fleeting pattern, easily broken. Her innocence, a thin veneer over a deeper, more fundamental chaos. The guilt that had once tormented him now felt like a trivial human construct, a small eddy in an ocean of indifferent, cosmic forces. He had not betrayed Alara, he had merely been a vector in a larger, incomprehensible unfolding. The artifact, he learned, was kept in a sealed containment unit in a separate section of the factory. He sometimes felt its presence, a faint thrumming beneath the concrete floor, a low, resonant frequency that no human ear could detect, but which his mind now perceived as a constant, comforting hum. It was inert, they said.
Dormant. Its work complete. But Marcus knew better. It was simply waiting. And he, Marcus, was its living echo, its unwilling, yet utterly compliant, prophet. He continued to draw, filling page after page with the impossible. His sleep was filled not with dreams, but with visions of cosmic architecture, of structures that folded space and time, of entities that existed beyond human comprehension. He no longer felt fear, or sadness, or hope. There was only the relentless, beautiful, terrifying logic of the universe, as revealed by the artifact. He was no longer Marcus, the astrophysicist. He was a conduit, a vessel, a living testament to a truth too vast for the human mind, now irrevocably broken and remade in its image. The tension was not in what he feared, but in what he had become, and the silent, unceasing hum that now defined his existence. The salt spray lashed Marcus's face, sharp as 1,000 needles, yet he felt nothing but the crushing weight of Ilara's gaze. Her eyes, fixed on his younger self, then searing into him, held an accusation that twisted his entrails. The cliff face wept, not water, but a viscous, dark fluid that coalesced into a distorted reflection of his own terror. He tried to speak, to explain, to beg for forgiveness from the phantom of his guilt, but his throat was a constricted pipe, incapable of sound. The frequencies from the resonator, though physically absent, still pulsed behind his eyes, a relentless, non-Euclidean thrumming that was both sound and pure concept, shaping the very air into his deepest shame. He saw the flicker of something else within Ilara's accusing eyes, not just her sorrow, but a vast, indifferent void, observing through her. Voices, rough and urgent, echoed off the damped stone. "Marcus! We have him!" He flinched, turning away from the light, the phantom Ilara dissolving into the weeping rock. He was on his knees, hands scraped raw against barnacled stone, the tide surging around his ankles. Two figures, clad in heavy protective gear, moved towards him. Their faces were obscured by visors, their movements efficient, devoid of emotion. They were retrieval personnel, he knew, dispatched by the Oversight Committee. He offered no resistance as they secured him, his limbs heavy, his mind a fractured mosaic of cosmic geometry and personal tragedy. He felt a strange calm settle over him, an understanding blooming in the wreckage of his sanity. The entity wasn't just out there, it was here, within the very fabric of his consciousness, a parasite that fed on the deepest, most inaccessible parts of his being. It had shown him himself, not to destroy, but to possess. He was taken to an abandoned factory, its cavernous interior stripped bare, repurposed into a sterile observation chamber. The metal walls gleamed under harsh fluorescent lights, reflecting nothing but the stark reality of his confinement. A cot, a table, a chair. That was all. There were no windows, only cameras in the corners, their unblinking lenses charting his every move. Days blurred into a seamless tapestry of quiet observation. He ate when food was provided, slept when exhaustion claimed him, and spent the waking hours sketching. He demanded paper and charcoal, and surprisingly, they were provided. His hands moved with an uncharacteristic fluidity, creating intricate, impossibly complex patterns that seemed to shift and writhe on the page. They were not drawings, not exactly. They were mappings of impossible spaces, of frequencies that existed outside the human auditory spectrum, of the entity's pervasive influence. The observing specialists, a rotation of individuals in white coats who never introduced themselves, would collect his drawings, their expressions unreadable. He heard their hushed conversations through the vents, fragments of technical jargon, references to anomalous neurological activity and unprecedented psychological fragmentation. They spoke of the artifact, too. It had been retrieved from the coastal caves, now inert, dormant. No discernible energy signature, he overheard one specialist report. No further emissions detected. A dead thing, perhaps. Marcus knew better.
He knew it was merely resting, its purpose fulfilled, its spores already scattered.
One day, he began to speak.
Not coherent sentences, not pleas or demands, but a steady stream of non sequiturs, weaving together astrophysical equations he'd once known with nursery rhymes, fragments of Ilara's laughter, and descriptions of impossible geometries.
The observing specialists took copious notes, their faces betraying a growing unease.
He watched them through the camera lenses, saw the subtle shifts in their postures, the way their gazes lingered on his drawings. He noticed a junior analyst developing a tic, a constant, almost imperceptible shiver. Another senior researcher began to trace complex, nonsensical patterns on the condensation of her coffee mug, patterns strikingly similar to those he drew. He smiled then, a slow, deliberate stretching of his lips that felt alien on his face. It wasn't a smile of joy, or relief, or even madness. It was an impossible smile, too wide, too knowing, lacking any human warmth. It was the smile of something that understood the true nature of victory, not through conquest, but through insidious, unseen permeation. The entity hadn't needed to conquer him, it had simply made him its instrument. The artifact was dormant, yes, but its echoes resonated now in every line he drew, every word he spoke, every flicker of unease he planted in the minds of his observers. The coastal caves had been merely a beginning. The true horror had only just begun to spread.